Hello, my name is Elise, and I am presenting about the Cold War and the Cuban Revolution. The Cold War was a long, passive rivalry between the USSR, the US, and the allies of the US. The US came out of World War II the strongest. Its economy was doing great because people were employed to fight in the war and to provide weapons and things like that for the war. So in 1939, the gross national product was $90.5 million, but that increased to $211.9 million in 1945. On the other hand, the USSR was not doing great. Their economy was faltering, even though they had a very strong military and a very high status. After World War II, the Allies were in control of most of Europe. The USSR dominated Eastern Europe, while the other allies had most of Western Europe. They decided to split Germany into 4 quarters, giving one to the UK, the USSR, France, and the US. While discussing the future of Europe at the Potsdam Conference, the Allies started to disagree. The USSR wanted to keep troops in their land and protect their borders, but the other allies didn't want this, and they also didn't want to have communism take over Europe. They wanted all of Europe to have democracies. Western democracies had always been scared of communism, especially after the Red Scare. East Germany, which is the part of Germany the USSR owned, held elections, but they were interfered with to make sure that the communists would win. After East Germany turned communist, Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of the UK, said it was like an iron curtain had divided East and West Germany. The Allies and the USSR were both suspicious and critical of each other, so they built up armies, produced weapons, created propaganda, and spied on each other to criticize each other's viewpoints. The Cold War is often called the War of Hostility because no military engagement took place. Until 1989, Europe was divided between the USSR and the Allies. Many crises and conflicts took place during this time. An example of this is the Cuban Revolution. From 1492 to 1899, Spain owned Cuba. Cuba fought multiple wars for independence. The US joined them in the Third War, which they ended up winning. The US was in control of Cuba for 3 years after that, until 1902. They improved Cuba through health projects and public works. Even after 1902, the US was still heavily involved with Cuba. Cuba had many corrupt presidents, which caused frequent coups and uprisings to take place. In 1940, Army officer Fulgencio Batista was elected as president of Cuba. After serving multiple terms, he realized he wasn't going to win the 1952 election. So, he launched a coup and took power. At the same time, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro was running for a seat in the House of Representatives. When the election got canceled, Castro tried to use law to stop Batista from coming into power, but that failed. So, Castro decided to create a revolution to save Cuba from dictatorship. Castro created an organization called the Movement. On the 26th of July in 1953, they attacked the Moncada barracks. Only 20 out of 135 members didn't get killed or captured, but they were also later found and imprisoned. Castro gave his famous "History will absolve me" speech when he was on trial. In 1954, Batista was re-elected. He felt like he had enough power, so he released political prisoners, including Fidel Castro. They left prison in May of 1955, and because they were scared of getting arrested again, they fled to Mexico, where Castro prepared to take over Cuba. On the 25th of November in 1956, 82 members of the movement left Mexico with a yacht. They arrived in Cuba on December 2nd and fled to safety in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they would campaign. Castro invited journalists to the mountains to tell people about his plans. Batista's troops attacked the group, which only left 25% of the members alive, so the movement recruited new members. In 1958, Batista decided it was time to end the movement with Operation Verano. But it didn't work because the movement's members were experienced fighters and they knew the terrain well. They blocked Batista's men's escape route and forced them to relinquish. On the 21st of August, Fidel Castro started an attack. He split his men into 3 groups. 2 of the 3 groups got to central Cuba, where they joined forces with other rebel groups. Batista realized this would be the end of his rule and fled Cuba. Castro made it to Havana on the 8th of January and seized power. Was Fidel Castro communist or nationalist? Well, the Cuban Revolution was supported by diverse groups of people. This included communists, Catholic church leaders, and well-known businessmen. The U.S. was concerned about the large amount of communist support, so they suspended arms shipments to Cuba. There are 2 main perspectives on what Castro believed in. Orthodox historians say that he had always been a communist, and his plan had always been to turn Cuba into a communist country. Other historians say that Castro didn't really have an ideology at all. He overthrew the government because he was nationalist and didn't really have any further opinion at the time. He just wanted to do what was right for his country. Castro was a nationalist. Castro had always been very ambiguous about his political opinions. During his speeches, he always referred to the government he would put into place as a revolutionary government instead of a specific type of government. This shows that he wasn't focused on communism from the start. When Castro defended himself in court after being caught, he said, "We were taught to cherish and defend the beloved flag of the Lone Star and to sing every afternoon the verses of our national anthem. To die for one's homeland is to live forever," which emphasizes his love of Cuba. The journalist Herbert L. Matthews, who interviewed Castro in the mountains and was the first to show that he was still alive, wrote, "Communism has little to do with the opposition to the regime. There is no communism to speak of in Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement." This also proves that Fidel Castro didn't specifically have communism in mind when he was planning to overthrow the government. Castro only became a communist because of practicality. After the U.S. cut off many diplomatic and economic relations with Cuba, and President Eisenhower's Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow the Cuban government failed, Castro declared he was a communist. But he only said this because he needed support from the USSR to finalize his revolution and prevent U.S. invasion. He also made his government communist to help the poor and give them resources. Becoming communist would also help Castro hold on to power. The Cuban Revolution is very significant to Cuba. If the Cuban Revolution hadn't happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis probably wouldn't have taken place in Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs invasion also would not have happened. Health improved after the Cuban Revolution. Before the revolution, the poor suffered from malnutrition and couldn't pay for health support. After the Cuban Revolution, income was distributed more evenly. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization said that 70% of Cuban people since the revolution live better than they did before. Housing also improved after the Cuban Revolution. In 1953, 25.9% of homes in Cuba were listed as in extremely poor condition. Most houses were overcrowded, had poor sanitation, and electric power wasn't available. In 1964, only 15% of homes were marked as being in extremely poor condition. But the Cuban Revolution also had some negative effects. Media became strictly controlled, and opposers of Castro were either killed or imprisoned. There are still many shortages of goods. Castro greatly impoverished Cuba. Overall, the Cold War was a war between the USSR and the Allies without any military engagement, and Castro was purely a nationalist who only became communist because of the circumstances he was in. Thank you, and this is my bibliography.